All right, welcome to the Starmen.Net Summer Art Bootcamp. This is Marty speaking, perhaps better known as Omnitarian, and through this 3-video series, you too will learn everything you need to know in order to create your own vector art. So essentially, I'm creating these under the presumption that you have no idea what vector art is, or what makes it special, or what you need to make it, or how to make it. So do not worry if you aren't very familiar with it. I will teach you everything you need to know, namely in this first video where we'll be going over vector versus raster as an image format, various vector art programs, and then I will also sort of give you inspiration for your prompt. The idea with this whole thing is that you, yes you, the viewer at home, will follow along with me and choose your own project to make a vector art illustration in. And I will give you some sort of advice or inspiration for that. So that's this first video. The next two, the second video is going to be me going over the basics of creating lines and creating shapes, sort of introductory stuff to the program. And then the final one, I'm going to create an entire vector illustration from scratch, teach you perhaps some of the more advanced features or tricks of the trade, that sort of thing. Everything you need to know in order to make good vector art. So let's start at the very beginning, which is what on earth is vector art. So let me switch over to this program called Paint.Net, and I'm going to create a line. Right, here's a line. It's not very fancy, and when I zoom in on it, you will see pixels. Okay, that's not very surprising. We are all familiar with pixels and how they make up an image. But let's go over to Inkscape, which is a vector art program. Let's do the same thing. We'll make a line. And now let's do the same thing we did before and zoom in on this line. Right? We can zoom in super, super, super far. Right? Like infinitely zooming super close. And you'll notice that no pixels show up whatsoever. So, what is this amazing sorcery? The difference is that Inkscape here is a vector art program. It's working in the vector data format, whereas Paint.Net is a raster program. It works in the raster format. So vector and raster are the two major sort of data formats for creating images. Raster is the one we sort of all know and love. Raster involves pixels, a whole bunch of, a big series of tiny squares that make up an image. Vector, on the other hand, works rather differently. The objects, or the sort of constituents of an image, our vector, are all made up of a series of points, these points right here. And they're connected by a sort of mathematical function that tells the program how the line is drawn, how thick its width is, what color it is, etc., etc. The idea behind that being that because the points are stored uncalculated in space, they have an x and a y value to them to show where they are, and then a mathematical formula that tells the program how they relate to each other. They can essentially be drawn at any scale whatsoever, and so vector images are not considered to have a resolution or anything like that. They are what we call infinitely scalable. And sort of other nuances to that, because raster images are made up of a series of tiny squares. When we select something, we move it around, right? We just take this chunk out. Vector, however, is storing this line as sort of its own object, and so when we select it and move it around, it's its own thing. Same thing up here. This sort of title is a whole bunch of individual elements that I can move around on their own. They don't overlap or otherwise get in each other's way the same way you would in a raster image. So with that said, just because it's infinitely scalable and every object is its own thing, that doesn't necessarily mean that vector art is somehow inherently better than raster. All it means is that it fits better for different projects or different things, what you're going for, mostly when it comes to aesthetics. So here, for instance, you can look at this illustration that I made for the last Mother 3 Fan Fest. As you can see, zoom in, once again, infinitely scalable. But it has a very particular look about it. You've probably seen it other places too, of course, that use vector. It's this sort of very clean, flat, digital-looking sort of sharp appearance to the image, whereas with raster you usually get things that are more like handmade, not like traditional media literally, but it has a more handmade feel look to it than vector art generally does. Not this line, of course. This line is just a Bezier curve. Anything can make that. But raster is better suited for things such as digital painting or image manipulation, photo collage, that sort of thing. Vector is sort of in its own little world, and there's a very particular look to vector art. So that hopefully clears up everything you need to know about vector versus raster data formats. When it comes to actually, let's say you want to make some vector art for yourself, there are a couple of programs that will do that for you. First off, the one I'll talk about is Adobe Illustrator, which is the thing we're looking at right here. Adobe Illustrator is sort of the gold standard or the business standard. Professional graphic design firms, illustration firms, they all like Adobe Illustrator. The downside about Adobe Illustrator is that while it's very powerful, it also has I consider a somewhat unintuitive user interface, lots of very complicated tools and options. And the big thing is that if you want to get your hands on Adobe Illustrator, it'll cost you several $100s, which is outside of many people's price point. The good news is that we have a program that exists called Inkscape, which is what I've been using here and what I use to make all of my vector art. Inkscape is an open source program, which means anybody can develop it, and anybody can look at the code. Open source, it is also completely free to download and use. And so Inkscape is what I'm going to highly recommend you use in order to follow along with these lessons. It's what I'm going to be using. And so there's really no excuse not to get it for yourself. The website is inkscape.org, or just Google search for Inkscape, you'll go right there. Once again, completely free to download, installs rather easy. It works for PC, Mac, and Linux. I've used the Mac version a little bit. It runs on this sort of vicarious platform. It's not really Mac-ish. What I'm trying to say is that there's a few bugs that exist in the Mac version, but the Windows and Linux version all work really well, relatively lightweight, although your mileage may vary, but even the Mac version is perfectly usable. I consider it to have essentially every feature you need in order to create proper vector art, just sort of without the bloat, and it's hard to argue with free. So yeah, get your hands on Inkscape and then start thinking about what your project is going to be. It's essentially, vector art is just another data format. You can create anything you want with it, but consider the sorts of things that are commonly made using vector. So some of those things are things like graphic design, so logos, badges, advertising materials, concert posters, those sorts of things. A lot of cartoons and animation use a vector, so things like Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends had a very vectory look. Powerpuff Girls had a very vectory look, although it wasn't actually vector. But things like that, anything that you can sort of look at or be inspired by that is vector-based, and you can sort of riff off it or play off it or whatever you need to do. I would recommend choosing a project that's not too ornate. So anything that has too many fine details or too many sort of strokes, I suppose you could say, with a pencil or something like that, try to keep it simple, because ultimately it's a very meticulous process in order to get lines into vector, as you'll see. So something that you can sort of wrap your hands around, and that would play nice in a vector style, would all work very well. So give that a lot of thought, and check back next time when I will go over sort of the basics of using the pen tool, making lines in vector, and sort of, Inkscape 101. Tune in.